Welcome to our final ATT&CKcon Power Hour. I'm your host and lead of MITRE ATT&CK, Adam Pennington. If you aren't familiar with MITRE, we're a not-for-profit dedicated to solving problems for a safer world. Through our public-private partnerships and federally funded research and development centers, we work across government and with industry to tackle some of the world's biggest problems. If you're here, you've probably heard of ATT&CK. The ATT&CK knowledge base is open and available to any person or organization for use at no charge globally. A couple quick housekeeping notes before we start. Along with your link to today's session, you should have also gotten a Slack invite. If you're already in our Slack, please join the ATT&CKcon Power Hour January channel. In that Slack, you'll find a channel dedicated to each talk by the speaker's last name. Please ask any questions you have for today's speakers there during and after their talk. Our own Jamie Williams may ask your question live, or the speaker will have an opportunity to answer it in Slack after their talk. I'll be wrapping up today's session with the state of the ATT&CK and 10 minutes or so of me doing an Ask Me Anything related to ATT&CK. So if you have any, start getting those questions queued up as well in the channel with my last name. Yes, today's session is being recorded. It'll be posted online once we're done editing and captioning the videos, hopefully next week. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker of 2021, returning ATT&CKcon speaker, Daniel Wyleczuk-Stern.
All right, thanks, Adam. Let me get my slides pulled up. And double checking if that looks good.
That looks good.
Excellent. All right, thanks, everyone. As Adam said, I'm Daniel, and I'm going to be talking to you all today about how to use ATT&CK to measure what matters and how to do things in the right order. Anytime you work on something, you're choosing to not work on something else. Therefore, when you're working in a cybersecurity organization with limited resources and motivated adversaries, it's important that you make deliberate decisions to maximize your return on investments for security projects. And I believe you can use ATT&CK to really help make those kinds of decisions. So a little bit about me, Daniel Wyleczuk-Stern, currently in Washington, D.C. I currently am a security engineer at Snowflake. Before that, Praetorian, and before that, the U.S. Air Force. I have quite a few cats, but I have managed to subdue them for this talk, so hopefully they shan't be bothering us. So what am I going to talk about? I'll go over some fundamental assumptions and principles that I have about cybersecurity and risk. I'll discuss some of the problems that I've seen when making decisions, some of the books and principles that I've read that have helped me formulate my hypothesis and the way I operate with risk. So just talk about the main idea with ATT&CK and how it helps, and then work through an example that really shows the power of using ATT&CK for quantitative risk analysis. And then also some devil's advocates, disclaimers, counter arguments, etc. So what are these assumptions that I'm operating from? One, I believe security is technical and applied risk management. The goal isn't necessarily risk elimination. As a security leader, your job is to spend just enough to reduce risk to an appropriate level. The hard part is that our field is not really good at quantitative risk management just yet. When I say quantitative risk management, I mean using numbers to drive your decisions as opposed to things where you've commonly seen such as low, mediums, highs, etc. This means using numbers and saying this is measurably more effective or measurably less effective than this and making your decisions based off of that. Below you see some common formulas used in risk. They're not super complicated, but they can be pretty hard to actually figure out how to actually calculate them. So why is it so hard? Well, one of the things that I've seen so often is when people do risk calculations or examples in books, they come to the thing like risk is likelihood times impact. Well, how do you measure those kinds of things? It's left as an exercise to the reader, and it's pretty hard to figure out. So how do we actually go about estimating how much risk we're actually going to reduce by implementing a solution? And then how do we ensure standardization across projects so that we can measure risks across a suite of portfolios or a suite of products that we're working on and make strategic high-level decisions? Luckily, I think these problems have all been solved, and it's just a matter of applying the theories to the work that we're doing. So these three books I would highly recommend. The first, How to Measure Anything, also has a cybersecurity edition, talks just about that, how to measure anything. Talks about measurements, estimation, sort of the intangibles of business, as it says. Thinking Fast and Slow is another bestseller that really talks a lot about a lot of things, but one of the things it highlights is probability and bias, and humans are naturally bad estimators. And then Engineering Trustworthy Systems talks about quantitative risk management and cybersecurity. There's a number of books on threat modeling and risk management, like FAIR, that I would recommend. So from these, I drew a couple of guiding principles. A lot of these are summarized from How to Measure Anything. Essentially, we have more data than we think we do, and you need less than you think you do in order to reduce uncertainty and drive improvements in your quantitative risk analysis. Especially risk quantification is possible through understanding your threats and doing threat models and threat profiling. So you see these kinds of improvements with consistencies and frameworks when it comes to application security. They use frameworks to stride and dread to drive actionable, repeatable, and defendable threat models that you can use to reduce your risk and make strategic decisions. However, how do we actually apply this to enterprise security? And now we get to the main idea, which is use attack, tactics, techniques, and procedures in your threat models. Sounds really simple and really easy, but the rest of the slide will sort of talk through how you actually do that and some of the benefits you'll get from that. So how do we get started? Well, one of the things that's very hard to do with threat models is get those kinds of measurements for likelihood and impact. Luckily, when using attack, a whole world of data opens up to us to get that level of granularity. So one example is from sort of people who have measured it already, such as the folks at Rapid7 who published the attack frequency diagram. So if you're ever looking at a threat model and you're wondering, I wonder what the likelihood of an attacker using PowerShell is, well, you have a number right there. And you may say, well, maybe that's not accurate to my organization. That's true most often, but still one of the principles of how to measure anything is that some reduction in uncertainty is likely better than where you were before. Or if you do have a unique scenario, luckily there's tools such as TRAM from MITRE or RCAT, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, which allow you to pull attack techniques from intelligence reports. And from there, you can begin to collect measurements yourself and really start to get measurements of likelihood and probability. Similarly for impact, somebody's already solved this problem. And if you're looking at, well, what is the impact of something happening? That kind of data already exists and it's not too hard to go find it. Again, it's probably not going to be accurate to your specific organization, but it's better than where you were before, where it was just a critical risk. Now we actually have numbers and we can begin to measure things and calculate return on investments. So I thought the best way to show this would be with an example. Let's say you're an organization trying to look at deploying a privileged access management system for your Active Directory or passwordless logons for your single sign-on solution. The first costs $50K a month and the second $5K a month. Additionally, you've recently had a pen test where the auditors came in and said, hey, you have a lot of passwords, attackers are brute forcing single sign-on portals, we recommend this. So your CISO is looking at the second option because it's cheaper and you've got auditors who are saying it's a good idea. However, with threat modeling and measurement, we can use attack to help avoid these kinds of recency biases. So what we're looking at here is a tree threat model, the kind of threat models that you'll see in books like Engineering Trusted Systems and a couple of other threat modeling solutions. Essentially, what we're saying here is that the privileged access management system would help us reduce the likelihood of an attacker obtaining access to a privileged account. From threat modeling, we decompose this into 4 nodes or 4 leaves, which we see at the bottom: brute force, credential dumping, access token manipulation, and credentials and files. And I've correlated those with their associated attack technique. Now, because we've done this, we're able to now get measurements from these and therefore determine an overall probability that somebody would obtain access to a privileged account. Well, how do we do this? Some of it can be done from measurements, such as from a pen test or from compliance audits, and some of it can be done from estimates and research, such as credential dumping. We can have our cyber threat intelligence folks pull reports and collect data and say, what is the likelihood of this happening? From this, we're able to get the overall probability of about 12%. Again, this isn't going to be it's not 100% accurate, but it's more accurate than we were before, where we were saying this is a low risk or a medium risk. We now have actual quantitative numbers, which we can use in our calculations. So what about after we implement this system? Whether it's through estimates or through a trial, we're able to remeasure and re-estimate. And through this simulated talk, we get a reduction down to about 2%. So 12% to 2% is pretty good. It's about a factor of 10. But that doesn't really tell us the whole story when it comes to risk. We also need to know the impact and harm. So obtaining access to a privileged account isn't necessarily harmful in and of itself. This requires us to build out our threat model a little bit more and say, what is the attacker's actual goal? In this case, we're looking at a threat model of compromising PCI data. Now, our leaf node obtaining privileged access is now our root node is now a leaf node in this threat model. And we can see that obtain access to a privileged account in the bottom of the screen. From our threat model, we've determined that there's a couple of ways that somebody could obtain access to PCI data, whether that's compromising the PCI database or compromising the website with a MageCart style attack. For those who don't know, the MageCart style attack is a class of attacks where attackers are able to insert malicious code into websites and steal credit card data as customers place orders. So from our additional measurements and estimates, we calculate that without any systems, without the PAM or the passwordless logons implemented, we have about a 12% chance of a breach of PCI data occurring. Using, again, the estimates from before with about maybe 70,000 records, we're saying we have a $10 to $50 million harm if this were to occur. Now with expected harm, we just harm times probability, and we have a range of about $1.2 to $6 million. Now, what happens after we implement the privileged access management system? We redo our calculations, and we can see that the expected harm has dropped to 200 to 500,000. Assuming a cost of about $50,000 a month, we now have a range for our return on investment. This may seem like a pretty high and wide range, and you're right. However, what we're looking at isn't necessarily what is the return on investment, but what is the return on investment relative to other projects so that we can make decisions about what we're going to work on and what we're going to work on first. So now let's look at the passwordless single sign-on solution. We have an and now, where an attacker has to obtain email addresses and passwords and MFA. Again, we're able to collect these through measurements and estimation, and we say that the likelihood of somebody obtaining access to an account is 1.2 times 10 to the negative 6, so pretty small probability. This occurs because they have to bypass MFA, and we also have some pretty good password requirements in our scenario. So what about afterwards? Afterwards, we say that the likelihood of phishing and brute force being successful, probably have to find some sort of bypass or maybe some kind of service account, has dropped significantly. And we went from 10 to the negative 6 to 10 to the negative 4th, which is a very, very large reduction in terms of factors, right? But how does that affect the impact of the overall risk? So now we've expanded the right side of the tree, compromising website via maze cart style attacks. In this scenario, we're saying about 15% are developers and 5% are admins who would have the privileges if they were compromised to be able to push malicious code in this scenario. Now, afterwards, we see that the right side of the tree has dropped from 10 to the negative 7th or so to about 10 to the negative 11th. However, because the left side of the tree is so dominant in the probability calculation, this hasn't changed the expected harm at all. And assuming a cost of $5K a month, we actually have a negative return on investment when we do these calculations. So what was the sort of point of this exercise? We were able to obtain pretty, not necessarily accurate, but pretty realistic numbers in terms of probabilities and impacts, and make a decision relatively quickly about which project would yield a higher return on investment and really reduce risk in a quantifiable way that we know now we're making the correct decisions about where to allocate our funds and allocate our time. And ATT&CK has helped us in terms of pulling up those likelihoods, and the data is readily available to us. So isn't this just threat modeling with ATT&CK? Yes, it is. But ATT&CK really helps with the threat modeling calculations to make a quantitative risk analysis and really help with those measurements and calibrated estimates. You may say you can't just make up numbers. Well, in this scenario, these are measurements and also calibrated estimates. And I highly encourage you to read How to Measure Anything, as it talks about how to do estimation. And you may say this example was too simple. And it was, but I was constrained on time. And also, we're not trying to get an exact return on investment. Our goal is to compare projects to determine where we would get the most return on investment and allocate our resources there. So this, you have to invest time in calibrating your people. I say estimates, and I want to separate that from guesses. And How to Measure Anything really talks a lot about how people are pretty bad at estimating probability, and we have to be trained on how to become good estimators. And I recommend starting with folks like cyber threat intelligence, as they're going to be the ones who have to do a lot of these kinds of estimates and have to pull from reports to draw conclusions. And this can also be pretty hard. Threat modeling in and of itself is a task that a lot of mature organizations struggle with. And when you add on estimations and measurements and calibrations, it can become even more difficult. And it's something that at my current organization, we're still learning and improving on. So I think I'm good on time. Are there any questions?
Great presentation, Daniel. That was fantastic. You got a lot of interest building up in Slack, and as usual, it's welcome back. It's always great to have a familiar face. So, big question here is, you've done a lot of research and a lot of good highlighting of how you kind of forecast problems and kind of like you said, see opportunities, see, problems and address them. But how do you calibrate that later on with, once you've instilled and kind of installed, these practices, these policies that you kind of forecasted, how do you calibrate that back towards, real world operations, comparing, what you saw versus what's happening to kind of, address some of those uncertainties that you highlighted?
So I think what you're asking is how do we sort of keep our models up to date? Again, that's one of the benefits of attack. A lot of folks or organizations will sort of store like, hey, what's our detection probability for this technique? What are our risks or our risk mitigations that we have applied to this? Along with that, we can keep our model of what do we think is the likelihood for this occurring and what are the systems that we have in place for that. So again, something like password brute forcing, we can say, well, we have our MFA solutions, we have our passwordless login solutions, and we can keep our repository of what do we think is the likelihood for this technique occurring, and even mapping that back to certain systems where maybe we have an old legacy database where when we match the technique with this database, it has this probability, and then we match it with our single sign-on solution, it has a lower probability. But then when we do these lookups, we can say sort of what the probabilities are for those systems.
Okay, that makes sense. And then, just kind of, you mentioned this was a very notional, very simplistic model, just for the sake of kind of highlighting this process. But, for those starting out that were really interested in kind of pursuing a similar approach, what is your advice towards, selecting, the subset of all of attack or even beyond attack to kind of build as a foundation for these models?
Sure. So this is more of a top-down approach versus a bottom-up approach. So I wouldn't say start with attack. I would say start with systems and risks. So let's say you're looking at implementing a new website or a new database. Those are the kind of business decisions that should drive this risk analysis. You shouldn't say, I want to start with cloud TTPs and look at my cloud threats, because that's the risk modeling should be driven top-down by your systems versus bottom-up by your threats when it comes to determining sort of where to look first. That's my belief.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, like you said, attack gives you kind of the coverage to understand like where those problems may lie, as well as, just kind of the perspective on the bigger picture there. I think another great question I saw just come in from Slack was, regarding your models, is there any way to kind of materialize and actually, manifest tangible, actionable results from those uncertainties? I think someone mentioned like Monte Carlo simulations or things like that to kind of actually quantify those.
Yeah, How to Measure Anything talks a lot about, and I think also Thinking Fast and Slow talks about using Monte Carlo simulations. So when you get these estimates and these ranges of probabilities, you should really start with a range. So I said 10 to the negative 1. You could maybe more accurately say, well, we think it's 5 to 15%. Then when you plug these into an Excel spreadsheet and you can do some Monte Carlo simulations, you'll get a range of risk that will sort of bubble up. It can get a little complicated. That's why, like for this scenario, and when you're first starting, I recommend just keeping it simple and seeing if you can get a decision that is clear without having to do those kinds of estimates. And again, How to Measure Anything talks about how to get the value of additional data when it comes to doing your measurements. Like these problems are solved. Like just read books, and I encourage you to explore the areas of risk and risk quantification.
Well, thank you very much, and great presentation. You definitely have a couple of questions building up in Slack, so definitely hop over there to address those. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Jamie and Daniel.
Thank you. Can you hear me well?
Can hear you. You can see your slides.
Awesome. So hi, I'm Valentine. I'm from McAfee, and today I'm going to be presenting about attackers thinking graphs. I was going to present this with Samantha, but unfortunately, I'm going to be alone. So building graphs for threat intelligence, here we go. So as mentioned before, my name is Valentine, and I'm from McAfee, the ATR team, which is the Advanced Threat Research team. And what we do is, at least our main goal is to identify and make sense of the broad threat landscape that we have in today's world. And my background is red teaming and blue teaming, and I'm also the organizer of the Women in Cybersecurity group of the Netherlands. Besides this, I'm a writer, I love cats and Dungeons and Dragons, and you can follow me on Twitter. So what we'll talk about today is all the data that we have at McAfee ATR about threats and attacks, the questions we have about that data, how do we build graphs based on the data, graph algorithms to answer questions about the data, issues with the data, and conclusions we can draw from the data. So as you can see, it's a lot of data. So basically, this is what our team is building currently is a broad overview of threats and threat profiles and everything about these threats. So MITRE techniques, threat actors, sector targeted, country targeted, and all of this. But in the back end, it basically looks like this because we are using MISP, which is a very powerful tool to deal with a lot of threat intelligence. And what we do is we get threats and attacks and events in MISP, and we divide this into MITRE techniques, target information, threat actors, sectors, tools used, etc. And this is what it kind of looks like in the backend. But what we have in MISP is a bunch of lists of data, and everything is all packed in these kind of huge lists. So how do we connect all this information? How do we visualize connections between events in MISP? So connections between threats, threat actors, attacks, MITRE technique used, and all of that. How do we identify trends in the data, and what are we missing? And this is where I looked to graphs to answer these kind of questions. And based on the data we have, I had more sub-questions, more specifically towards MITRE techniques used by threat actors and identifying patterns in these techniques used for this talk. And these sub-questions that I got are based on the data we have in MISP. And it's frequency questions, popularity questions, and patterns. So identifying patterns like, are actors using the same techniques in the same way? Can we identify groups of actors using the same techniques? So the way I represented the data originally was event-based. So we have technique used in event, tool used in event, targeted country, attributed to actor, and targeted sector. And this is basically what the output was. So by graphing all the events in this representation, we have this huge, big blob of a graph. So the first thing we do notice is that it's very dense and highly connected. And the second thing we do notice as well is that we have very sparse sector and country information. So in the events that we have in MISP, often either the country is not reported because it just targets every country and there's no specific country, or an attack is directed at multiple sectors. So this is why we chose in our event-centric representation to just scratch the country and sector node. And then we just collapse the event nodes to create a actor-centric representation to answer questions that are more about behavioral patterns, so actors using MITRE techniques. So I'm going to be showing different things on these two representations, so event-centric and actor-centric. So this is our event-centric graph, and this is the actor-centric graph. So to answer the question, which techniques are observed most often, one way to answer this question is to look at degree analysis. So degree analysis is just looking at nodes that are directly connected to one node. So in an event node or a technique node that is connected to a whole bunch of events is basically the most popular technique. In order to answer this question about which techniques are the most common across actors, then we need to look at the actor-centric graphs for the behavior of these actors. And we use centrality algorithm on an actor node, and then we look at the MITRE techniques that are most connected to it. And then we have, for example, in this case, it was obfuscated files or information. This is the most used technique across actors based on the data that we have. And then can we identify groups of actors using the same techniques? In the actor-centric graph, we apply community detection algorithms to basically be able to cluster actors together. But one thing that we did notice is that the graph was still very, very dense. And there were no, at least using the Chinese whisper algorithm, there were no clusters that were identifiable. If we use the Louvain detection cluster detection algorithm, then we do find something, but it's still not completely that we can say for sure that these clusters are valid. And then based on our data, we have one more question to answer, which is, are actors using the same, actors using techniques in the same way? So we look at the actor-centric graph, but it's still quite a dense cluster. So in this case, we wanted to introduce more information to maybe be able to differentiate actors in a smarter way. So what we did is introduce kill chain information. So a technique that belongs to a specific kill chain step. So this is the new representation proposed. Actor uses technique and technique is used for this specific step. And this is the resulting graph. The problem is that it's still a quite a dense graph. The only thing that we have that is kind of isolated from the rest is on the top right. And this is the actually the mobile attacks. So that's why it's isolated from the rest. So the reason why we have this issue, let's say, is basically something else. It's the MISP granularity level that is just not good enough if we want to use kill chain step, if we want to introduce kill chain step to be able to differentiate what actors are doing and how they're using these techniques. Just simply because in MISP, a technique that is used across multiple steps is saved the same way. So there's no way to say this actor used this technique for this specific step. So it would be really nice to have that in MISP, to be able to have this differentiation when exactly an actor used the technique, because it is registered when you store it in the in MISP, in that event. It will store all the steps that is connected to that technique and not just one that you want. So that would be nice to have. And then what we also notice from the data that we have is that actors seem to be using the same steps all the time. At least there is this big cluster in the middle where it's just all the same techniques that everybody's using. So maybe if we scratch these techniques out, then we would see the least used techniques, and that could be an interesting thing to do. So this is for future work. So conclusions about building graphs the right way. As I mentioned before, we talk a lot about data. So you have to know your data. You have to know how to represent it the right way if you want to make something concise, and if you want to use the algorithms as well to be able to answer your questions and answer your specific questions. And building graphs helps us visualize data instantly. It helps us make sense of the data that we see, and it helps us connect things together. But you have to know your data, and you have to know how to represent it the right way. But we still have a few questions that remain, and one of them being, how do we add more granularity? Is the data we receive complete enough? And maybe we could incorporate additional sources that would help us to actually have this differentiation between threat actors and their behaviors on how they use these techniques. That's it. I think I'm pretty good on time.
Very good on time. Thank you. That was great. And as personally, I'm a visual learner, so I appreciate any one time someone takes like raw data and puts it in a form that just I digest a lot easier. So definitely appreciate the work you're doing. I think first off, one of the biggest questions we're getting in Slack is what are you using a particular library or tool to make your visualization? Is that like Neo4j or something, or is that a proprietary?
It's a proprietary tool. Yeah, it's from actually Samantha could have said more about this, but it's a in-house tool that is built in-house from up-level security. Okay. That is now owned by McAfee.
But you said it's ingesting the raw data from MISP, correct?
No, we have to have a step in the middle to basically pull the JSON out of MISP and then put it in the graphs.
Okay, tracking. So one of the interesting things you mentioned, and I kind of have two related questions here. The interesting concepts is, you have the data going in, and then you can identify as much as you can about that data, but then there's the conclusions that come out of that. Kind of walking us through that pipeline. What is your approach or kind of, advice for people like, looking at what data they're ingesting and figuring out, what do I need and what am I missing in terms of actually building out the graphs that kind of answer the questions that they want to address?
I think in the beginning, at least for the data filtering part, there needs to be a data filtering part. Like you have all of this data and you need to sort of trim it to have the least things you need possible, let's say. And then there's also another ways to think like in reverse about it. So what is a graph that you want, or what is an answer you want, and then base your data on that. That's also a trick to do.
That makes sense. And then I think what caught a lot of people's eyes was the introduction of the concept of the kill chain. Like to me, I saw that in your slides before. I thought it was really fascinating. Can you speak a little bit towards, you kind of touched on it a little bit, but at what point, like you said, you had a very particular question that just wasn't being answered from your data. How does that, what's the process in terms of, enriching your data with these additional concepts, as well as, and just in general, can you elaborate a little bit on what was the kill chain and how does that relate back to like attack in terms of like, I'm thinking like a tactic, but maybe a little bit higher?
Yeah, so it's interesting because in MISP, we have a whole lot of information about the sub techniques, but looking at it from a distance is also very useful to just see, because data obfuscation, for example, is everywhere across multiple steps, but might be interesting to see which threat actors use data obfuscation. Maybe they use it at this point, the others use it at this point, and then we might be able to differentiate. So that's where the incentive came from. But it would be nice to have a way to basically say how the technique was used and incorporate that in the graph. So to have that element in there.
Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I love the kind of way you walked us through, like, here's a graph of everything, and then you slowly started carving up into exactly what you need. But kind of, for those just starting off and building off their own graphs, how do you know, how do you calibrate that? Like when you have too much data versus too little, is it kind of working backwards, like you said, based on your ability to answer your questions, or like what's kind of your considerations during that process?
So at least one easy way to see if your graph is good or not is like the connectivity level. So if everything is interconnected, then you need to start trimming somewhere. Another thing is also like I mentioned for the country and sectors, if you just have nodes that are that don't really mean anything for your graph, just leave it out as well. And I guess it's like when you run the clustering algorithms, and if you don't find any cluster in your data, then it's also an indication that everything is just, there's not much variance across the data. So you cannot really identify clusters, and then you have a kind of a useless graph.
Yeah, which might be an input problem. Yeah, that's like a flat graph really doesn't mean much. It's almost an oxymoron. Yeah. But with that, yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of interest building up in Slack, so definitely pop over there to address your mini fans now. But thank you so much, and I'm going to punt it over to Adam to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you,
and thank you to both of you. Our last external speaker of ATT&CKcon Power Hour, we have Gert-Jan Bruggink.
So thanks everyone. Amazing to see Valentine's and Daniel's talk. It's really cool. I'm also pretty excited to share some thoughts on a particular topic that is close to my heart. One being attack, obviously, and the second being combining that with economics. Short, who am I? Gert-Jan from the Netherlands, co-founded FalconForce. I'm a defensive specialist there, focusing on cyber threat intelligence. And over the last 10 years, I've been specializing myself in cyber threat intelligence, building security operations, and enabling strategic change. In this session, I would like to get you thinking about three topics. One being the industry's emphasis on post-compromise behavior. Things to be said about both sides. The second thing is related to using attack as an evidence-based statistical mechanism that you can use, for example, to build a security program or perform audits or whatsoever. And finally, some creative ideas on how you can use, or let's say, tune your defensive strategies to impact the cost per intrusion incurred by adversaries. I think attacking economic considerations when defending against techniques has always been an effective strategy, and I think this deserves a bit more attention. First of all, let's take a quick look at the cyber crime value chain. So Kerman, Hang, and the team dove a bit deeper in what this actually is and try to structure the value chain in a way that's understandable for normal human beings. The essence is that actually it consists of 4 steps: discovering vulnerabilities, prepare, exploit, deliver the exploit, and then performing the actual attack. Now, are there other things associated to it? Yes, there are. It needs to be managed, basically, like your average startup or DevOps team, basically. But also the marketing has to be done. And people need to do the work, basically. So there's actually, if you look at like an example, I think there's a common misconception that this is easy, that this is just an attack. And I think this needs to be managed in a different way. So a common misconception I get from business executives is that they sometimes use security as a finite problem, right? They want to see it as they can eradicate the risk instead of just managing it. And I believe this mental model is wrong. And I think, for example, you cannot stop burglars. You cannot stop all burglars. You cannot eradicate all burglars. Instead, you need to understand what the burglar is doing and why. And this results into things that you can actually do to mitigate. Now, comparing common burglars to more sophisticated activity groups, such as UNC 2452, yes, there are definitely differences between them. And sophisticated, and I believe everyone will go through actually the similar steps to understand the return on investment of an attack, right? They'll probably be asking themselves, can I use my basic set of tricks or tools? Will it make a lot of noise if I break the glass? But also, what will I do if I get caught? Now, to look into that, I basically used attack to create, let's say, a proper frame of reference. The next thing I did was actually explore the framework into my big data engine so that I could do some research on it. So I'm asking myself the following, can my target detect actually the usage of this attack? Is there any tooling readily available? And also, what is the level of proficiency one needs to actually execute the attack? And then I looked at this data from a defender perspective and actually took the interesting lessons and put them in the slides here. I'm always curious where the organization wants to defend. And I think breaking down what is actually in what phase of this cybercrime value chain compared to attack, I think that gives me a lot of new insights. Now, looking at this, there's a small disclaimer. Where, obviously, when I started looking into this, we had the thing called pre-attack, which actually was deprecated last year. And it was replaced with T23 reconnaissance and TA42 resource development. That being said, let's dive into a bit on the early phase. So what is it that we can actually see and do? So it was actually pretty easy to establish what we can see and can't see. First of all, the reality is that the majority is not observable. It's high occurrence, takes place outside the organization. And if you want to mitigate it, you're better off focusing on related stages of the cybercrime chain. Now, what is it you can actually see? Is there anything? Yes, you can see some things. 3 things, actually. Searching of the victim-owned websites, active scanning, and phishing for information. In fact, these things can even be automated, allowing you to see some options for defending them. One example is using the amazing tool Grey Noise to actually correlate targeted from untargeted information, or traffic, sorry. Now, if we basically look into the second component, which is the preparation phase, it gets a bit more, let's say, nuanced. I need to dive a bit deeper into the sub-techniques. Now, similar to the previous phase, most of it can effectively be detected, but there are things we can actually do. There is acquisition of new domains. That's something we can see. Creation of social media or email accounts, mostly social media accounts, and actually tracking certificate usage. And what I'm actually trying to visualize here is that we need to start having a strategic discussion on this phase and on the previous one. Where do we want to defend? Where do we want to detect the adversary? Do we want to detect him coming in close to our organization? And make a conscious decision on that. Now, if we move one step further, this is where it gets interesting. The third phase is actually the initial access phase, right? So the reality is there's only so much ways to get into the organization. And I think this is also evidenced, by having just 9 categories of ways how to get in. Technically speaking, every single technique mentioned in this particular tactic has detection opportunities in there. So that's easy. Now the question then is, where do you focus on the most, right? Where regularly we see 3 techniques as most dominant. Number 1, always phishing, huge attack factor, year after year winning the go-to method for gaining initial access. And the same goes for external infrastructure. The interesting element to external infrastructure is that over the last 10 years, we saw an evolution from the perimeter to the endpoint, and now that the endpoint is pretty locked up, you see people move to the perimeter again. It's crazy. It's like a hype cycle. And finally, obviously, also the obtained credentials. That's also a big thing, always a thing to keep in mind. Obviously, due to some recent developments, it's also good to mention supply chain attacking. And it's easy to say that this is a big thing, obviously due to the SolarWinds situation, yet it's been happening for quite some time. For example, Access in 2019, NotPetya 2017, but also Target in 2013. From an economic perspective, you need to understand that these attacks are very high cost, very high risk, but then again, also very high ROI. So we probably will be seeing them for the next couple of years. In the end, again, here's where you actually make the strategic discussion again and thought, where can we make the most impact? And I actually believe that this is the phase where you can actually make the most impact, preventing adversaries from getting into your network. Now, finally, the remaining bit, the attack itself. So similar as previous phases, all have detections. So what can we do? First of all, regardless of the technique, coverage of the attack should never be the objective. Whatever you're doing, don't just focus on just having every technique covered in detections or whatsoever or preventions. I think you can be flexible in that. But in the end, you need to prioritize what you're going to focus on. And that's the second thing I really like, which is some vendors, for example, publish top 10 lists of most used techniques. And this helps you to prioritize some of the research you're doing. So for example, Red Canary, awesome corporation, gives a really good report on what are, for example, the top 10 most used techniques they're seeing. And this helps me when I'm building a security program and saying, okay, so this is basically the top things we're seeing. If all vendors give that, then I get a good understanding of what is being used, right? So that's pretty cool. The third thing is actually the whole OST debate, if you will. So I don't want to comment on if OST dropping is bad or good. I'm not going to touch that. But from an economic perspective, there's pros and cons to both sides. What I do want to emphasize is that by it being out there, we can understand it, prepare accordingly. This way we can prioritize investigations and figure out what is unknown and what is known, instead of just looking at yet another package, the Cobalt Strike Beacon, for example. And a good example, if you're interested, is actually looking at some of the research Paul Litvak presented at Fires Bulletin 2020, mapping trajectory usage of open source tooling. Amazing presentation. Now, finally, the most important discussion, if you will. So the bottom line of what I'd like to advocate here is sharing low-level initial mitigations. This could be little detections. This could be little, I don't know, hashes or whatever you can see, or maybe even response playbooks, whatever you can share with the community. I think everything that raises the bar, that is valuable. And this is difficult. This is a difficult discussion. We have it, for example, in our team, we had difficult discussions with this as well. What can we share? What can't we share? How will it impact our business? But I think this is important because you get into a point where you can actually say, this is what we can share. That's where we actually want to get at. Now, if we look at, so this basically concludes the 4 steps of the cyber value chain and gives you insight into what are some of the things you can do in the initial phases also of the cyber, but also what can you do. Now, to top it off, I want to share some closing thoughts on this one. And it has always been, my first one is, it has always been an asymmetric fight. You know, as a defender, we always need more time and resources to effectively mitigate and manage risk. You always take more time and effort than the attackers. You know, they work faster, they deploy ransomware completions every minute. And that's actually, again, coming back to my previous slide, this is why I advocate 2 things. You know, use of smaller initial mitigations as early in the value chain as possible, preventing the entire attack. This will allow you to see it as basically a tripwire, but not just one tripwire, like 1 million tripwires. You know, if the first one fails, then probably another one will capture it. And I think from obviously from a statistical perspective, you also need to do some tracking. And I think the attack framework is actually pretty suited for that. And I think in that extent, when you're thinking about developing your strategic program, your audits, or simply want to start doing something about security, start using this, start mapping it towards attack, and think about educating people in using the mental models of you can't eradicate risk, you need to manage it. And also think about the economics. That being said, that's my that's what I want to be sharing with you today. I hope I have some great ideas for all of you, and I'm happy to see you in the chat.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, and I just want to say that was an amazing title. I love Attack-Onomics. That's really catchy. I love it. So I think first question, just kind of top of my mind, is you're covering something that a lot of people, I guess, probably don't consider. It's not a metric that is very often measured on, especially on the adversary side of things. So it does open up a lot of questions. But you did mention this is a little bit more often than not a strategic practice. Do you also see this being applied tactically? Like, what I'm thinking of is like you see in an actual breach or an event and working backwards from actual data, kind of, doing these same types of calculations.
Yeah, the reality is no. so I think Daniel, for example, the first speaker, had a good comment on that, is that for example, the quantification of risk, that's very difficult. And even if you do it on a strategic level, on a tactical or operational level, it doesn't matter. It's always difficult. But what I'd like to advocate is that you in any way start thinking about it, and even if you are working in the trenches, thinking about where can you put the most effective defense in there, and using the economic argument. I think managers across the world don't argue with that. It's a logic thing to do. And I think this discussion is something that isn't happening. It's more like, hey, I think this is good, or I've seen that research and that's good, but we need to be thinking about how are people operating, and adversaries are just like us. They want to automate things, they want to automate tools, and if that doesn't work, they move on to the next target. And I think that's where you need to play around with.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Another interesting point is I love your last conclusion slide about kind of the asymmetry of cyber. Offense is has a bit of a curve in terms of innovation, and just opportunistic. Only have to be right once. Do you think what other metrics or other variables do you think kind of are what kind of materialize that gap? I know you mentioned time being one, but how do you think economics as well as other things plays into that same kind of dichotomy there?
Yeah, the reality is that there's you can actually build entire mathematical models on this, and I don't have all the answers to say these are the 5 metrics you want to be looking at. What I tend to see is also from experience, from talking with my colleagues, from talking with peers, from talking to basically we want to see how easy is it to use a tool. Is there something available? Did somebody publish a script on that? Did somebody basically look into share a description on how that works? And that can, teams can do that themselves. But I'd like to understand that those are things that I like to understand. Really simple things, not complicated calculations, just simple things that allow me to say, this is where I can make more impact because we have POC code available, or somebody dropped a tool on that. That's a bit of the thinking I have on that one.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I think my final question here is, we have definitely hop over to Slack. There's a lot of interest building and some really good questions there. But, is this being besides this talk, like, are you publishing any of this work, or is this being shared with the broader community, or is this something that you and your team are just kind of doing in, for your particular use case?
No, so I'd love to explore this further, also from a more scientific perspective, because there's way more research opportunities in there. So if people are interested in working on this topic with me, send me an email and we'll get started. But this isn't a proper research yet. Wink, wink.
Love it yet. But with that, thank you again.
Wanted to wrap up today by presenting the state of the attack. This has been kind of a tradition the last few years during ATT&CK to get into what's happened over the past year, what's coming in the next, and sort of where things are going. I'm also going to do a little bit of wrap up on ATT&CK as we go. So since we're calling this the state of the attack, and with apologies to our non-American viewers, the state of the attack is strong. So ATT&CK is backed by quite a few more people than you're seeing here on camera. So, Jamie and I are here on camera. You're seeing a few more team members on Slack, but there are at least 39 members of MITRE staff that we would consider part of the ATT&CK team. So there's a lot of people who, at least some portion of their time, is helping all of the stuff you see actually go. The thing that we talk the most about, and you often hear about, is enterprise, but we have a lot of other teams that are working on other pieces of ATT&CK. And so, ATT&CK for cloud within enterprise, network devices, industrial control systems, and mobile. And we also have teams that work on pieces around ATT&CK that either keep us going or are working with it. So the cyber analytics repository, our infrastructure team who does things like keep the website and all of our internal tools going, our threat intel team who's working on stuff like groups and software, and outreach working with our blog. So this year has been a little bit different for ATT&CKcon. We probably would have had a in-person conference this year. Obviously, COVID happened, changed a lot of things in terms of conferences. We saw people having a lot of virtual conference fatigue, having trouble sitting through multi-day conferences as the email is still coming in, still sitting at your desk. And so we wanted to try something a little bit different with ATT&CKcon Power Hour. So a lot of the elements of a traditional conference, but spread out into these 90-minute sessions. By the numbers. So we had a call for papers that was open in 3 weeks last August. So a lot of these talks were submitted quite a while ago at this point. You guys are procrastinators. 46% of submissions were on the last day. 73% were in the last 4 days. ATT&CKcon is a pretty selective conference as it has been in past years. There was only a 28% acceptance rate. And the way we actually do the selection of talks is we start with a program committee of 6 people who is judging the talks blind. The people judging them don't actually know what company or person they're coming in from. We're just wrapping up 4 90-minute sessions over 4 months with a total of 20 talks. Yes, they are all recorded. Yes, they all get posted online. And yes, slides are posted as well. So some of the themes that we've seen over the past few months. In past years, we've heard a lot about attack for enterprise, and we had a decent number of talks around it this year too. But there was a lot of cloud this year. We had everything from statistical analyses in Azure Sentinel, cloud detections with KQL, mixing attack for cloud and enterprise together, which has come a long way from Ryan Kovar's talk at the first ATT&CKcon, where he expressed our current state with a sad cloud graphics. In terms of other pieces of attack, we had what we believe is our first mobile talk from Ali Mellon, looking at EventBot, which goes into another theme, threats. Besides EventBot, we also got to hear a bit about TA505 and Ocean Lotus, and a lot of different threat hunting behaviors. Attacks kind of cheating as a theme, but I mean something a little bit broader here. We had a couple of talks, we learned really interesting use cases, like learning it as an educational tool or for modeling adversary economics that we just had. Finally, as we learned about Katie's journey, seeing new facets around attack from her new role, we all learned the right way to pronounce Mishta. So where does that leave us for 2021? We don't really know yet. We'll be making a decision later this year on if there is an ATT&CKcon, what form it'll be in. So stay tuned to our various social media. Most likely place to see it is on Twitter or LinkedIn. We are planning on keeping the Slack live that we've been using for Q&A as a place for people to be able to discuss all things attack going forward. So looking back on 2020, this has been definitely an interesting year. Certainly was never expecting to be, presenting at ATT&CKcon from home, but yeah, we've made it through. We've done a lot of things around attack. Throughout all of this, in talking about both 2020 and 2021, I've got links throughout that are at least in theory short enough for you to type, but I will also be releasing slides so that you've got all those links later. Here's where 2020 started with enterprise attack. We had 266 techniques. And this is really what attack looked like on a PowerPoint. We usually cheated. We draw a white box over the bottom of defense evasion and persistence, make it look like it sort of fit on a PowerPoint slide, but they were really much longer than we usually pretended. It didn't really fit here. By the end of 2020, we had chopped off those tactics and doing sub-techniques, which I'll talk about in a second. We got it so that it was sort of the same shape as a PowerPoint slide. And then we added 2 more tactics and messed it up the other direction. So we're now up to 177 techniques, but with 2 new tactics and a lot of sub-techniques under those that are filling in a lot greater detail. Sub-techniques were probably the biggest change that happened in attack this past year. And I know this was probably painful for a lot of you, having to adopt sort of a big shift in how the matrix is organized, but we thought it was worthwhile. We had ended up with a pretty big abstraction balance across the knowledge base. So where we were adding some techniques that were very narrow and covering very specific activities, and some that were covering half the planet, like masquerading. It had become sort of our most common complaint. It's something that had come up at the past 2 ATT&CKcons quite a bit. The other thing that we didn't think was being fully expressed was that techniques do have a lot of depth to them. A lot of people just read the name and assume what that covers. We're trying to help people in looking at their coverage. So, just one analytic that's covering one procedure, maybe you don't want to make that technique green. And finally, there was the PowerPoint problem that too many techniques, the matrix is too big. And so just trying to express the state of the universe. You've probably seen this by now, but the way it's basically looking is that we still have tactics, techniques. We have this new element sub-techniques under them, which are more specific techniques. So instead of just OS credential dumping, we have these more specific ways that adversaries are performing OS credential dumping. And so it's been out in public for a little while now, so I'm not going to spend too long on this. But if you go to a new technique page, what you'll see is that we've now got sub-techniques. So we've got these multiple entries that are falling under a lot of them. Not everything has a sub-technique. And similarly, every sub-technique has all of the same information that you're used to being in a technique. This is the way things are going to be going forward. We will not be updating the pre-sub-technique version of attack ever again. We have left it out there in public so that people can still work with it. This has now been out there since July. So we really hope that people are a decent ways now into leveraging this. But we know that this is still hitting a lot of people. We even feel some of this pain too, as just that we have a ton of PowerPoint slides, training, and everything else that we still need to update as well. The second way that the shape of the matrix changed this year was that we added 2 new tactics. So we've used some variant of this slide the last 2 attack cons, where we've been striving towards a goal of it's just attack. So the piece of it's just attack that we took care of this year was merging enterprise and pre-attack. We'd started a little bit of this in previous years where we had created the initial access tactic out of a couple of existing tactics in pre-attack. But just a couple months ago, we deprecated the pre-attack matrix for a new platform and 2 new tactics in attack for enterprise, the pre-enterprise platform. This ended up being reconnaissance and resource development in enterprise attack. And they drew from the scope of a number of different tactics in pre-attack. And so these are all behaviors taking place before an adversary gets into an enterprise environment. The criteria for what came with us from pre-attack was that techniques needed to be technical. They needed to be visible to some defenders. So, maybe an ISP or a DNS provider, somebody could see the adversary doing it. And we wanted some evidence of adversary use. We wanted to know that it was real. And this is what it looks like. They've now been out since October, where you have reconnaissance, where we have 10 techniques and 31 sub-techniques, split into what the adversary is doing and how they are accomplishing it as they're gathering information that can use to support their targeting. We then have resource development, which is adversaries getting ready for actually doing their targeting. So this is things on infrastructure, accounts, and capabilities, making up 6 techniques and 26 new sub-techniques. This is a brand new part of attack, and so we're especially interested in feedback on this. If you see things that we're missing, things that we need to add to this, please let us know. Jamie and Mike went into much more depth of this at the November ATT&CKcon Power Hour. There's a link here to their video. You can find it on YouTube, but like I said, I will be sharing out my slides afterwards. Another new addition that I think some people may have missed that we did recently was attack for network devices. It's a new platform in attack for enterprise. It is techniques that are being done by adversaries against network infrastructure devices. So things like routers and switches, sort of the big iron tying the internet together. This included 13 techniques and 15 sub-techniques that were either added or modified. And so some things in pre-OS boot and other areas that are describing things that are unique to routers. I encourage people to take a look at this. Yeah, we're not sure how much more we're going to see in this space. There isn't a ton reported out on it, but this is another new space that ATT&CK is covering in the last couple of months. It's hard to believe that it was this year, but we started off the year by releasing ATT&CK for ICS. And reason we did this is that the industrial control system space is different. It's not the same as the Windows, Linux, Mac systems that we're used to. I mean, for one, if it's running Windows, it's probably Windows 2000 or Windows XP. But the adversaries have unique goals. They're often focused on impact and destruction who are operating in this space. The technology is really different. So it's not just PCs, it's these devices on Modbus, other protocols, PLCs. And then the defense is very different. In a lot of cases where we tell an enterprise, just go and patch, that's maybe not acceptable advice to a industrial control system. It may not be possible. The vendor may no longer support it if you patch to a different version. And so it's a very different space in terms of what defenses are realistically possible. We've released the matrix and updated it over the course of this year. We very recently released a version of it in Sticks. It's now supported in Attack Navigator as well, which was a big request from people. And so there's a lot that people can now do with this matrix. This is still under active development. And so we're interested in feedback, things that are missing again, different adversaries in the space. And Otis went into more depth on ICS just back in December. And so again, his video. But the part I think people may be probably waiting a little bit more for is what's coming in 2021. So what's next on our horizon? I think there are some people that may be a bit relieved by this slide. So ATT&CK for Enterprise has a number of different platforms in it. It has Windows, Mac, Linux, cloud, the new pre, and the new network devices. Our plan for 2021 is for it to be a period of stability. Our hope is that we've now made the really big structural changes that we needed to make. And so we now have no changes as big as pre or subs currently on our roadmap. We do have some changes. I'll talk about some other ones that are coming, but nothing that is totally breaking the model and reshaping the matrix to the extent that we have this year. The other thing is we, in the past, have not generally announced ahead of time what our release schedule looks like. And so want to change that. I don't have a date yet, but our major releases are currently planned for April and October, as they actually have been the past couple of years. So be on the lookout in April for ATT&CK version 9 and in October for ATT&CK version 10. That said, we are preparing for a point release to ATT&CK. So there was an event that happened recently that I suspect a lot of you are aware of, where there was a supply chain injection around SolarWinds Orion product, a group that FireEye is calling UNC 2452. One of the things that was a little bit unusual with this intrusion is that we saw a number of behaviors in it in reporting that were not currently describable in ATT&CK, especially in the cloud space. We saw some things that we had not yet seen evidence of adversaries doing in the wild before. And so we're adding a couple of new techniques to ATT&CK. We've released a preview of that, of what things we're going to be adding in 8.2. We've even released the technique IDs that they're going to become. And that link there is actually to our blog post that we've been doing. As we've been tracking all this information that's coming out around it, we've also created a GitHub repo that is listing the related reports we're looking at that have behaviors in them. So what we're tracking is reports that have original reporting looking at data related to the intrusion that we think are going to help people fill in the picture a bit more. And that shortened link is going to lead you to the GitHub repo where we've been storing that. Both resources are being regularly updated as people release additional reporting, more often than not at 5 o'clock on a Friday. but we're trying to keep on top of it, and as things have been rapidly moving. Mac and Linux have been in enterprise attack for a number of years now. They're not a new addition to attack, but they haven't necessarily gotten as much love as Windows in the past. And so we'd like to fix that. We've got a new team member, Kat Self, who's working right now on spiffing up, looking for gaps, improving our Mac coverage. And so we're slated to be releasing some new Mac techniques as well as updates to existing techniques in our April release. For our October release, we're looking to focus on Linux. And so improve that space, add new techniques, and take a closer look at what we actually have in attack and improve that. And so we're always, in theory, working on Mac and Linux, but we've got a specific focus on it this year. One other thing that means, other than there's potentially new content for people to use, is that this would be a very good time if you have material or things that you think should be in attack around Mac and Linux to send it our way. Now, I said no big structural changes, and this is the closest we come. So we are making some changes to attack this year. If you remember last year, we made mitigations an object. So we took them out, we added metadata behind them. We made them a much richer part of attack than just a string or a text blob describing what was going on. Data sources in attack are currently a list of text strings, so things like file monitoring, process command line parameters, process monitoring, and Windows registry. So there's not much behind that right now. We know a lot of people have done good things with these. People have done analyses, graphs. We've even generated posters out of it ourselves. But we felt that there could be more there in order to help defenders understand what it is they should be looking for in their data to actually find what's going on. So what does that look like? So we're working on a much richer model than just a name. The data source that will now appear in a technique would be based on the main data element that it's related to. So something like a process or a user, the high-level element that's actually being described. In order to get all the way over to the other side with the data you're actually collecting, we're working to add the pieces in the middle by enriching those data sources with metadata. We'll now have something called relationships, which describe the interactions between different data elements that are being collected. Basically, the thing that you're looking for in the end data. We'll also have components that are ways of grouping these relationships. Another way you can think of components is getting more specific than the data sources themselves. At one step of our development, we were even calling them sub data sources, but didn't want to confuse people with having two subs in 1 year. Basically, you'll be able to see what the actual data is that you're looking for to be able to detect a technique. I am just touching the surface of what's going on with data sources right now. So I encourage you fully to go take a look at two very deep dives that have been posted on our blog by Jose Rodriguez, member of the attack team, taking a look at our thinking around data sources and how we're actually planning on implementing them in attack. So we've had the blog out for a couple of weeks, but announcement today is that we're slated to be adding these into Attack for Enterprise in our April release. And so this, which is also in the blog post, gives an idea of what the sticks is likely to look like. So how the actual data is going to appear in attack. And so the extra new metadata that's going to be appearing around data sources as they become an object. Now, I'm only talking about Attack for Enterprise right now. But our expectation is that this should flow to other parts of attack over time. And we believe this will dramatically improve attack data sources, the processing people are able to do on them, and enrich some of the analysis that people are really looking to do today on their data sources. Attack for Cloud. So we currently have broken out an attack for cloud, Azure, AWS, and Google Cloud as 3 different platforms. And the reason we did that is when we originally released Attack, we weren't really sure if we were going to find different techniques in each of these, or if they were really similar enough to be able to group them together. We thought it was safer to start with them as separate platforms, that it'd be easier to merge them later. What we've learned over time is that we really are not seeing differentiation in these infrastructure as a service platforms. And so we are planning on, in our next release, merging these up together into a single infrastructure as a service platform. Now, this might worry you, so that we also have SaaS platforms and attacks, so things like Office 365 and Azure Active Directory. And our plan is for those to stay in place, and we're looking at additional SaaS platforms now. So we're taking a look at what's out there, what are people using, and what do we have enough threat intelligence data to be able to say, what are adversaries doing? Cloud's also moving to data sources along with us. So this is some of the same data source, data component that you've seen that we're doing for rest of enterprise attack. It's just that the places that the data is coming from are a little bit different in cloud, where it's leveraging various collection interfaces that are provided by the various cloud hosting providers. Jen got deeper into this in her October ATT&CKcon Power Hour presentation. There's a link to it here, but you can find it on our YouTube playlist, or I'll be releasing the slides later if you want to copy and paste the URL. Containers. A lot of people have asked us for attack for Kubernetes. It's been one of our more popular requests over the last couple of years in terms of a platform that's become really popular out there, and people want to understand what adversaries are doing in it. We've even seen some people create attack-like matrices. So this is attacks, or Microsoft's attack-like matrix that they called their threat matrix for Kubernetes. Now, this isn't attack. It isn't based on threat intelligence. It's based on the art of the possible. And so this is really good work, but not something that we would call attack for containers. So MITRE Ingenuity Center for Threat Informed Defense has created a project with research partners that is taking a look at if the intel is out there for us to take that final step and do an attack for containers. They're investigating adversary behavior, talking with a number of different partners, and trying to gather what intelligence is out there on not just Kubernetes, but things like Docker and other container platforms. We're not sure how it's going to be organized yet. We're not sure if there is enough intel to be able to add this as a new matrix to attack. But if you want to see this added to attack, the best way you can do that is contribute and help tell us what's actually going on in this space. Jen isn't just our cloud lead. She also is leading this and published out a blog post on MITRE Ingenuity's blog, talking about our work with attack for containers and what it is we're looking for in terms of intelligence. Another Center for Threat Informed Defense project, but we think it's going to have potentially a lot of impact on the attack community, is the Attack Workbench. We've released a lot of pieces of our own attack ecosystem to let people work with their own techniques, be able to create an internal clone of the attack website, be able to display their own information. But the missing link has always been the editor that we use under the hood. So we've never felt that the editor that we use was really in a good place to be able to release to the community. And there are a lot of things that we'd also like to do beyond what our current tooling is able to do. So Attack Workbench is going to be a tool that allows users to explore, create, annotate, and share extensions of attack. We've encouraged in the past best practice of creating your own attack techniques, and reflecting information that you're seeing. And so this will be a way that people are able to share techniques with each other and hopefully share them back to us so that we can more easily add them to attack. We're planning on taking this over later in 2021, having it become our team's content creation tool, but also slated for release to the public later in 2021, presumably as open source. Finally, attack for mobile and ICS. So a lot of what I've been talking about, a lot of what we hear around attack is enterprise attack. But this theme of it's just attack still is here. So in the past, we've talked about potentially the merger of pre-attack, enterprise attack, and mobile attack. Well, we've done the pre-attack merger, and we are still taking a look at, is it a good idea or not? And does it match people's use cases to actually merge mobile attack and ICS attack into enterprise attack? And we've definitely heard both sides of that. We've heard pro and con coming from a number of places, and we encourage you to just continue giving us that feedback. We're interested in hearing what, positive and negatives you see and having these be one thing. But what this means this year, though, is working towards feature equity with enterprise. There's some things we've done in enterprise, things like data sources work, where that we expect them to now trickle down to areas like mobile and ICS attack. More rich threat data is being added constantly, especially in mobile right now. And so our goal is to get closer to equality between the different attack knowledge bases, even if they don't end up ever being just one squished together thing. Otis Alexander, like I mentioned earlier, gave a talk just a couple months ago on attack for ICS. Link is there. Mobile, we're about to be putting out some more information than we have in the past. We really haven't done much in terms of blog posts or other material around mobile. We're planning on putting out a separate mobile roadmap for 2021, as well as some technical posts getting into different aspects of mobile. I want to wrap up with a thank you to the attack community. So you guys have contributed so much, brought us so much information that this is probably the last year we'll be able to recycle this slide. 190 of you, if I'm not mistaken, on here. And we do have some contributors who have asked not to be named, so the list is even bigger than this. Social media, it's been kind of incredible watching the people who are following us across various platforms. This is just Twitter, but Twitter and LinkedIn together is over 100,000 people, which is kind of crazy for us. We're seeing a lot of great work in the open source community around attack. So 195 repositories just in GitHub. And there's a lot of work out there elsewhere. And we love seeing this. And we love hearing about it too, as you are interested in sharing with it. I've intentionally left some extra time at the end, more than we have scheduled a lot of our other talks, in order to let people ask any questions they have about attack and attack going forward. So with that, I will stop sharing.
I'm tracking
and assume Jamie's camera is on. Excellent.
Yeah, I'm tracking the Slack. So we got a couple things. We had a couple of great comments, and we really love the overview. So thank you. But first, just kicking this kind of session off, we're definitely opening it up for any questions people have in the community. But in reality, there's not very many opportunities where we have a chance just to talk to the whole community. So kind of my personal question is, as the lead of attack, what is one thing you wish the attack community understood more, or just kind of kept in the back of their minds when using and working with attack?
So it's easier if I planted questions ahead of time, but I didn't. So probably the one thing that I'm focused on personally is making sure that people understand the threat intelligence roots of attack, that we are not intending to be a standard. We're not intending to cover everything that is possible, but we are driven specifically by threat intelligence. There are other resources out there that are focused on the theoretical. But it's sort of our driving focus and a little bit of what makes attack different. And so, there are people that aren't necessarily a fan of that, would rather us cover everything that's possible. But you might make the people that are upset about attack being as big as it is sad. Attack can be used as a prioritization mechanism where it is having that focus. And so, the number one thing I want people to understand is that the things that are in attack are things that have been done by real adversaries in the wild.
Excellent, thank you. And we just had a great one come in from Susan. She noticed that CAR is using a small set of data sources, specifically versions of Sysmon. Is there any plans to extend CAR out, in kind of tandem in parallel with the new data sources model, or kind of maybe even expanding out further to something close to Sigma, or where does CAR kind of fall in the 2020 roadmap?
Yeah, and so they've been tracking closely with us as we've been working on the data sources work itself. So my expectations that would be coming along. I don't know if Jamie, if you want to add anything too, given your involvement both working with them and on data sources.
Yep. So yeah, on that point, we've been working with the stakeholders on CAR very much, and we realize these kind of are two very compatible projects that should kind of have some semblance between them. So I don't think we have any defined plans yet, but we do recognize that as we kind of scope out and build this kind of more granular model with attack, it does make sense that something like CAR would parallel that, but nothing set in stone yet. So definitely stay tuned for any announcements.
And as with a lot of other pieces of attack, one of the best ways to see it grow, see it do new things, is to contribute. We do work ourselves. We do look at a lot of these things ourselves, but definitely areas where we are seeing active community participation definitely increase the likelihood that we're going to be adding stuff.
Yep, and on that, there's an issue tracker for both GitHub projects. So if any ideas and any great perspective, just feel free to submit it there. We're happy to collaborate, as Adam said. Another good one that just came in is you mentioned the version 8.2 of attack, the release regarding the the solar gate and the solar winds activity. Is there any defined dates for that, or is that still kind of a TBD?
Very soon now. So we were looking for a bit of a pause in reporting. We do expect, like a lot of the rest of the community, for this to be something that goes on for the next several months. But we do seem to be in a bit of a breathing space now. So we're sort of wrapping up techniques. And Jamie, I know that's a question you have on your mind right now too. But we're probably, if I had to make a guess, it's next week sometime.
Okay, thank you. Just fun one here. What's your favorite technique?
Mishta.
Well done.
and I'm not even looking at Slack for the hate I'm going to get from pronouncing it that way, but sorry, Katie and I pronounce it the same way.
I think there's three of us now. Just kind of a vignette here coming from the community. Can you speak towards, some common examples of, things that you quickly identify you're using attack wrong, or, common mistakes people make when trying to adopt the model or apply it to their cybersecurity problems?
Yeah, so trying to do everything at once is probably the biggest we see, where people run away screaming from attack. Attack is sizable at this point. I mean, the Svelte matrix that came out in 2015 has had a lot added to it, multiple new tactics and a lot of new techniques. Sub-techniques in some ways makes that even bigger. So you've got a smaller matrix in showing your coverage, but there are more things if you're trying to turn attack into a checklist. And so really, really recommend doing some prioritization when you're getting started with attack. We've published a series last year or 2019 called Getting Started with Attack, that we published as an ebook, as a blog series, has turned into other forms as well, that get into some different ways of prioritizing. And we think that's really important for people to think about, rather than trying to do everything at once. Probably the other direction we see is, in some cases, I worry about overanalysis of some of the material we put out. And so, we are threat intelligence driven, and we are not trying to cover the planet in the material that we have. And it's as we see it, it's as it's reported, it's as companies decide to talk about things that are going on. And so there are biases in a lot of the information in attack that can make statistical analyses, in some cases, meaningless, or way off in terms of sort of the interpretations that come out. And one of the places we see that a lot is in our groups and software data. And so, anything where we're talking about a technique in a group or a piece of software is the known knowns. It's the things that we have seen in reporting. We have evidence that we can back up and cite that an adversary has done it, but we have no idea what the unknown space is. And so it's how popular is an adversary, how commonly reported out it is. Did it even catch our eye in terms of even making it into attack? And so, it's sort of a very different area than trying to do everything at once. But that's probably the other thing that keeps me up at night around people leveraging attack.
Awesome. Thank you. And then one of your last slides was, the wall of fame, all the contributors of attack. And, we preach this over and over again, how important contributors are to building and populating and growing attack. Can you kind of, it might seem daunting to many. Can you kind of talk us through the pipeline of, what is the contributor experience like? How does that actually go, just to kind of, make it more real for people? So I know there's so many perspectives out there that we just want to capture and make sure everyone has a fair opportunity to push data back to attack.
Yeah, and it's all over the place. Obviously, this question Jamie could answer as well, but we get a really wide range of contributions. Yeah, so we do really appreciate it when somebody sends us a complete technique that has mitigations and detections and data sources and everything we might want to know about it, or sends us a mapping of a report already done that we're able to fairly easily bring into attack. But a tap on the shoulder that we're missing something, we're more than happy to work with that. So if you're telling us, hey, I saw this technique, you guys are missing it. Here's this description of it over here that talks about how it happened. We are also willing to do the legwork, and team leads for enterprise, taking in the information, filling out those details, bringing the rest of it, going back to you and saying, is this what you meant? And then adding you in as a contributor. And so we are more than happy with that whole range. And we will work with you on sort of either end of that. And so it doesn't have to be that you feel that you're ready to write your own techniques. Just letting us know what we're missing, especially if it's something that you're seeing from a real adversary, you've got reporting that we might have missed, more than happy to see that. Excellent. Jamie, if there's anything you think I've missed there.
No, perfect. Thank you. And then I think we're coming on time here, but final question is, what's your favorite thing about attack? There's so, you covered it perfectly. There's so much stuff going on, but what really kind of settles with you the best?
I like it as a way to kind of keep fresh in the various things that adversaries are doing. With its size at this point, being able to just dive into it and learn about a technique. And I come from a computer science background. I'm relatively comfortable with sort of the underpinnings of a lot of these spaces, but still just going in, taking a look at a specific sub technique, really getting to understand it, be able to think about how I would detect it, how I would see it. Yeah, I think that's a kind of a fun thing with attack, and that's sort of my personal fun with it. I'm also I'm a threat intel guy, so I'm a big fan of sort of the groups and software, keeping track of a lot of what threat actors we're seeing and reporting, and trying to piece together a picture, just understanding what is it that a single actor does. What are the various activities that they do over the course of an intrusion. I like to dive into the data personally.
Same. But with that, thank you for your candid and honesty. This was great. And I think a lot of really good insights shared with the community. So, with that, I'm signing off for the day, but another great iteration of ATT&CKcon, and thanks again, Adam.
Yeah. And thanks to everyone who's joined us over the past 4 months. Again, as I said during my talk, we don't really know what 2021 is going to look like, but stay tuned. We'll check out on social media, and we'll be announcing as we go. With that, thank you for joining us, and thank you for attending the ATT&CKcon Power Hour.